Okay, I think we're ready to get started. So welcome everyone. We're excited to have you here today, and we're going to be talking today about when does Medicaid planning make sense? And if you're here on this call, then you've probably heard of Medicaid, you have some idea maybe what it is, and you're not sure when you or a loved one would qualify. You may have heard that you can do certain things in advance to qualify, and when should you do that, and when does that make sense, and when does it not make sense? So that's really what we're here to talk about today. And I encourage you, if you have any questions or comments, that you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we're happy to address those either as we go along or at the end. So I'm Shannon McNulty. I'm the founder of the Village Law Firm, and I am here with my colleague, Jamie Wolf. And Jamie, we both do estate planning. Jamie has more focus on estate litigation, estate administration, and Medicaid. And I focus more on international and tax planning. And so I wanted to kind of bring our joint knowledge together and discuss this. And so Jamie and I are going to engage in a discussion, which I hope will be helpful to you. So the first thing I want to start with is what is long-term care? Because when we're talking about Medicaid planning, kind of before we even get to Medicaid, we're talking about like, where does this conversation start? And where it really starts is it starts with what care we're going to need as we get older. And as we get older, everyone is, we're unfortunately not immune. Nobody's immune to the declines that time takes on us and aging. And so we may have problems with our cognitive faculties. We may have problems physically, and we may need assistance. And I should say this isn't even just for in those cases, because you could need long-term care even if you're not elderly, but you get into a really bad accident or something, you need significant rehabilitation, or can be permanently have permanent needs. So, but long-term care is really when sort of supporting services when we can't do our own activities of daily living, such as dressing, bathing, cooking. So those are kind of where we start with it. And there could be other things that are long-term care, and that could be lengthy rehabilitation. And this can take a lot of different forms. So Jamie, do you want to tell us about what forms long-term care can take?
Yeah, so long-term care, so we can be talking about you need, you need help with your basic activities of daily living. That's dressing, bathing, cooking. And then it also can include nursing home care. So if you require, 24-hour care, it can entail assisted living facilities. So you're mostly able to care for yourself, but you need sort of a little bit of assistance. And then also physical therapy as well. So if you need any sort of rehabilitation.
On a long-term basis, right?
On a long-term basis, exactly.
Okay, so what are our options for long-term care? What covers, aside from we just pay this out of our own pocket to write a check for it or put it on our credit card, which generally is going to be quite expensive, what options are there to help us with these expenses?
Yeah, so there's Medicare. Medicare covers doctor's visits, they'll cover your ambulance services, medical equipment, and some prescriptions. Medicaid will also cover 90 days of rehabilitation. So after 90 days, it's coming out of pocket, but they will cover generally the first 90 days. Medicare does not cover nursing homes or assisted living facilities. So while Medicare is a great option, it does have its limitations. There's also private insurance. So
I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what Medicare covers, because a lot of times I'll ask clients, what is your plan for your long-term care? And they'll say Medicare. And that's just, unfortunately, Medicare is not going to be sufficient if you do need long-term care. It's not going to it's not going to cover home health aides. It's not going to cover any in-facility care more than 90 days after the discharge of a hospital. So anything after that, Medicare is done with it. You're not going to get any coverage from Medicare if you need those kinds of services.
That's right.
So Medicare, just to be clear, is not really a long-term care plan.
There's also private insurance. So you can purchase a long-term care policy, but there are some limitations with those as well. Most will not cover the full extent of the full cost of a nursing home stay. And many of them have term limits as well. So they won't cover past a certain point. So again, while it is great to have that private insurance, it's not as if you can depend solely on that private insurance, because it's very rare for them to pay the full cost of the nursing home.
And then we have Medicaid. So tell us about what Medicaid is and what it covers.
Medicaid is certainly more encompassing, and Medicaid will cover the cost of many long-term care needs. So they will cover the cost of nursing home, they'll cover the cost of home care aides, they'll cover doctors, they cover prescription and non-prescription drugs, rehabilitation facilities. So it's going to cover, it sort of fills in the gap where Medicaid and private insurance doesn't, the things that Medicare and private insurance don't cover.
Okay. So if you have long-term care insurance, but there are exclusions on it, or it runs out, because a lot of long-term care policies, they are good for a couple of years, but then it's not going to cover anything after that, or they may have some kind of dollar limitation, then private insurance is not going to cover either. So really the kind of last resort, other than paying yourself, is for Medicaid to cover it. But from what I understand, Medicaid is not necessarily particularly easy to come by. So let's talk about like what eligibility is. I think most seniors are eligible for Medicare. Private insurance, you have to actively get. When talking about private insurance, we're not talking about health insurance, like we have to just cover our doctor's visits. We're talking about specific long-term care insurance that you have to purchase separately, and you should get it in advance, well in advance of when you need it, because as you get older, the more expensive it gets. And sometimes it's just prohibitively expensive. Whether long-term care insurance is a good idea, we'll probably have a whole other conversation on that topic, because there's a lot of things to consider with that. But you do have to actively purchase and be covered at that time to receive coverage by a long-term care policy. But Medicaid is the other option. And tell us about, can anybody just get Medicaid? Like Medicare is so broadly, is it just we pay, we've all worked and we can just get Medicaid as well as we get Medicare?
So Medicaid is actually quite different to get. There are very strict requirements and eligibility standards. And so it's means tested, which means that Medicaid is looking at your income and your assets to determine if you qualify. And there's also a physical assessment as well to determine if you really do need the care.
Okay, so there are restrictions. So let's talk about those restrictions of who is eligible to receive Medicaid.
Yes, you have to be a New York resident. You have to be over 65. You have to have some sort of disability or be blind. And the toughest one to sort of satisfy is the financial eligibility standards. So if you're a single applicant, you can only have up to $28,134 in resources. For married applicants, it's $37,908. And there are income limits as well. So for a single applicant, you can only have $18,756 of income per year, and that's $25,272 for married applicants. So if both applicants are applying. And I want to point out here that your spouse's assets are considered as well for the Medicaid application. So even if your spouse is not applying, Medicaid is going to ask for your spouse's resources, and we'll take that into consideration. It won't affect your eligibility, but Medicaid may require your spouse to contribute towards your care.
Okay. And This is pretty low in terms of the assets. We're talking about less than $30,000 for a single person to have. What does that cover? Does that cover like my house? Does it cover my retirement accounts? What does that asset test cover?
So there are certain exempt assets.
But generally it
But
covers.
it will pretty much cover all of your assets. So wants to know about pretty much everything that you own. There are certain things that aren't taken into consideration when doing the calculation, but Medicaid does look at everything.
Okay.
And so
Let's talk about those exempt assets that fall outside of that very small amount for the asset test of like 30,000 or what was it, 30,000 or 30, or I'm sorry, yeah, about 28,000 and 37,000. What falls outside of that wouldn't be counted towards those amounts?
you can have a homestead. So that's a primary residence and still qualify for Medicaid. But there are certain limitations. So you have to either live in the home or intend to return to the home. Your equity has to be less than 955,000 in the home. It's not going to include vacation homes or rental properties. And there's sort of strings attached to it. So if you own a home, you're able to qualify for Medicaid, but when you pass, Medicaid will put a lien against that property. And when it's sold, they are entitled to be reimbursed for any care that they've provided, so covered for you. So whatever amounts they've spent on your care, they will be entitled to off of the top of any sale of that home when you pass.
Okay, so I can qualify for Medicaid even if I have a house that is worth, say, $900,000, but after I pass, then that doesn't go to whoever I left it to, that the government is then going to get that money back from the house and require maybe the house to be sold and get their money back.
Well, it's when the house is sold, that's when they get their money back. If there's anything left over, that would go to the family, but they're entitled to be reimbursed from the top off of whatever, all of the amounts that they've spent on your care.
Okay. Okay, so it's great that then I could qualify, but it's not so great for maybe my kids because then they may be left with nothing if it ends up just all going after I pass away, that it ends up with the government.
Right.
Right. Okay, so what other assets are not included in that asset test?
Okay, so if you have a qualified retirement account, so that's a 401k or an IRA, Medicaid doesn't look at the principal amount as long as those accounts are in payout status, meaning you are receiving the required minimum distribution each year. So Medicaid will look at the income it generates, but won't disqualify you if that the principal amount is, let's say, over that $26,000. It's really the income that they're looking at, not the principal.
Okay.
Medicaid also doesn't take into consideration the value of one car that you own. They also don't look at your personal property. So unless you have some very valuable painting like a Van Gogh, Medicaid is not looking to see, sort of your furniture, your jewelry. They're not taking that into consideration. And term life insurance. So other life insurance policies may be counted in the eligibility standards, but term life insurance is not calculated as an asset.
So that vehicle, can it be like a Lamborghini?
One vehicle is exempt. So
Okay, so it could be,
if you have two Lamborghinis, it could be a problem, but just the one.
Something, or it can be, a very expensive car, which is very interesting. And personal property, does that cover all of my, I could have a lot of jewelry and I could have expensive jewelry, that's not going to disqualify me?
That's not going to disqualify. Even on the application, they're not really asking about those sorts of things.
Interesting. Okay. So those are a lot of good things that we can keep that would be exempt. But again, it could end up getting some of this through the estate. Is that correct? Like if we have the Lamborghini, is that?
If anything goes through the estate, Medicaid will put a lien against it. And again, they're entitled to be reimbursed for all amounts of care that they covered during your life.
Okay, so that Lamborghini may not be safe for your kids is the message.
Right.
Okay. See. Okay, so that was what's exempt from that asset test for eligibility and what is exempt from the income test because we had to have also a really low income threshold to meet.
Yeah, so there's this nice loophole that Medicaid does accept and approve of. So there's what's called a pooled income trust. It's a nonprofit trust that's set up, and you can distribute all of your excess income, so any income above the limits, to this pooled income trust. And there are some strings associated with this trust. So whatever is distributed to the trust can only be used for the applicant's benefit. So the applicant can send their own personal bills to the trust to pay, but they can't pay for anybody else. It's not like they can use that money for gifts for family members or even a spouse. So it will cover half of the, if the applicant has a spouse, it will cover half of the household bills. Whatever's remaining in that trust when the applicant passes stays in the trust. It's not returned to that applicant's family.
Okay, so that seems like a great option that you can put the money into this pooled income trust and still benefit from it. And how do I get the money out of that trust? Like, can I just take it out? Like I have a bank account, I could just take it out and use it?
So basically the way it works is that you have to send the trust company your bills and they'll pay the bills directly. You can also have a direct deposit set up. So if you have a recurring payments each month for one of your bills, you can set that up directly, but it's not as if you have an ATM card and you can just withdraw money. There are restrictions and limitations on this account. So you're really sort of losing control over the money that's sent to the trust company. And the trust company actually has to approve the expenses that they're paying or that you're requesting them to pay.
So again, if I wanted to use this money to buy a Lamborghini, then actually maybe Maserati this time, then maybe they might not approve that expense.
I wouldn't say might not. I would say they're definitely not going to approve that expense. That's sort of out of the scope of what they'll pay. But anything sort of more reasonable, certainly anything that you need to survive, food, rent, utility bills, they'll have no problem covering those things. And even some sort of entertainment, expenses for entertainment, they'll cover, but nothing as extravagant as a Maserati.
But certain things, like if I wanted to go to the movies or even to a show, maybe I could use the money for things like that, my cable bill.
Right? Exactly right.
Okay. Great. And then for there's an exemption for income that can be used for your spouse. Tell us about that.
Right. So Medicaid doesn't want to impoverish the well spouse, the spouse who's not applying. So there's this rule that says that the well spouse is entitled to $3,435 of income. So if the well spouse has no income, if they're not receiving any sort of income, well, then they're entitled to $3,435 of their spouse's income. So that's not going to put the applicant over the income limitations. That's sort of not counted as the spouse's income for this eligibility standard.
Okay, so the spouse's income doesn't count. We don't look at that. They don't have to use their own income for that. Even though Medicaid might look at their assets, they're not going to require the spouse's income. That's not going to be render the applicant ineligible.
Correct.
Okay. And okay, so that sounds pretty reasonable. What other options? And I think the pooled income trust seems like a great vehicle for getting under that income threshold. But how about for my assets? What are the things that I can do to get my assets under that very low threshold?
So you can transfer assets to a spouse without any sort of penalty. So you can transfer, let's say, a house to your spouse today, and then tomorrow you would qualify and Medicaid wouldn't have a lien on that property. So all transfers to spouses are permissible, obviously having in mind that Medicaid can ask your spouse to contribute towards your care, but at least you can qualify for Medicaid. You can transfer a house to a relative who has been living in the house for 3 years prior to your application. So it's not as if a child can move in and then the next day you apply for Medicaid and say, well, I transferred my house to my child. They have to have been living there for 3 years in order for it to be an approved transfer and still for you to qualify for Medicaid. And then finally, you can transfer assets to your children, either to your children or to a trust 5 years before you apply for Medicaid without any sort of penalty.
Okay. Great. Okay, so this is before the look back period. So what does that mean, this look back period? We can transfer.
So what a look back period is a period in which Medicaid will look back to see if there were any suspicious transactions. So when I say suspicious transactions, it's a recurring transaction or a large transaction. So anything over $2,000, that they're going to flag that and they're going to say, well, was this a gift? Was a gift made? What was this used for? And there's different look backs depending on what you're applying for. So if you're applying for institutional Medicaid, which is nursing home coverage, it's a 60-month look back. So that's 5 years worth of statements that they're going to review. If you are applying for community Medicaid, so community Medicaid being, you're looking for home health aides to come to your home, there's a 1-month look back. And I just want to point out that this will increase as early as the earliest it would possibly increase is in March 2024, and it will increase to 2.5 years.
Okay, so right now, this look back period, so for institutional Medicaid, meaning in a nursing facility or something like that, would be, we have to make that transfer 5 years, at least 5 years prior to the time that we apply. And to be eligible for community Medicaid right now, it's very short. That look back period is only 1 month. So we could really qualify pretty easily if we need to for community Medicaid right now. We could just transfer everything and just wait a month and then we would be eligible. But you're saying that I think that the legislature recently changed those rules, but that they're not quite in effect yet.
Exactly right.
Okay, so in that case, then to qualify for community Medicaid, again, community Medicaid means you're in the community, you're in your home usually, and you're receiving some kind of home care. And so that is going to, right now we can do it, it's a pretty liberal rule, but in the future and a year, like a year and a half or more than that maybe, this is going to change to a 2.5-year look back period. Okay, so what if I say I transferred my house and then and then I applied for community Medicaid, I'm sorry, institutional Medicaid the next year. I didn't wait the 5 years. I needed it. I thought I would have enough time because I wasn't planning on having to go into a nursing home, but I do need this care. So I ended up applying earlier than I expected. So I didn't have this whole 60 months I had to wait.
Yeah, so then there's going to be a penalty. And so Medicaid won't begin coverage until you've privately paid during that penalty. So you'll have to privately pay for the value of the amount that you transferred. Once you've sort of satisfied that, then Medicaid will deem you eligible.
Okay. So that could be a problem if we transfer something to somebody else and then we don't have that anymore, right?
Correct. Exactly.
So that could be a real problem. So I think that's something that it's important to kind of just be aware of, and also just making sure that we're thinking about these things in advance because you don't want to end up in that situation. Okay, so you said we can transfer assets to our child or somebody else, another relative maybe, or friend, whatever, before that look back period. And we could do it directly, or so I can say I'm just going to transfer my deed of my house over to my daughter, and she would, and then I could wait and apply for Medicaid after that 5-year period, or I can do something called a Medicaid Asset Protection Trust. Tell me, what is the difference between transferring it to my daughter directly or transferring it to a trust, this asset protection trust?
Yeah, so if you transfer the asset directly to, let's say, a child, there are going to be certain tax disadvantages. So if you transfer it to your child while they're alive, it's a carryover basis. So that when they sell the property, the IRS considers the value of the house when you purchased it, and whatever gains there are going to be taxed. That's that capital gains.
I just want to take a step back because I think we're talking about something that's not necessarily having to do with Medicaid, but is a tax consequence. And so, and just to explain this tax implication, the rule of what we call stepped up basis and capital gains taxes is that if basically capital gains is wiped out when an asset passes by through a will, when it's received through an inheritance. So if I buy my house for $100,000 and then if I transferred it to my, we'll just say buy the house for $100,000, the house is now worth $500,000. If I transfer it to my daughter and she sells the house, then she's going to have to pay capital gain on that $400,000 gain, that $400,000 increase. But if I just keep the house and it passes to her through my will, then if she sells the house, she doesn't have to pay any capital gains taxes. So that's all wiped out. And so what Jamie is saying is that if you transfer it to the daughter to qualify for Medicaid, then you're going to lose that tax benefit. But if you transfer it to a trust, then you're not going to lose the tax benefit. Correct?
That's exactly right. Also, if you transfer it directly to a child, well, then it's their asset and you lose sort of all right to that asset. So it's not, they can then do with it what they want. They can sell it. And that might not be something that you approve of. So you're really losing all sort of control if you transfer it to a child. If you transfer it to a trust, there are certain protections and you have the right to live in that property. So you can protect your rights better if it's in a trust.
And also, if we transfer it to a child, then they may have some issue of their creditors. So if they get into a divorce or they get sued for some reason, or they need to qualify for government benefits for any reason, then that could be, the asset could be gone and then you have nowhere to live. Right? So there are definitely some downsides, both tax-wise and protection-wise, and also for control-wise, that having it in the trust allows you to have more control. And you can replace the trustee who is managing the asset. So if you're not happy with it, then you can replace them. And you can change the beneficiaries of the trust. Jamie, tell us what that means.
Yeah, so there's a power of appointment, which says that you're able to change the people that you've named as the beneficiaries in this trust. So the trust is irrevocable. So generally, you can't make any changes. You can't revoke it. And so you are losing certain controls over the assets that are placed in the trust, but you still retain some control in that you can change the trustee. So if they're not acting in your best interest, you can remove them and replace them. And if you decide that you don't want the beneficiaries you've named to remain the ultimate beneficiaries, you can change those beneficiaries as well. So there is still certain flexibilities associated with this trust. But it is important to note that the grantor, the creator of this trust, they do lose access to the principal to any principal asset that's in the trust. They can manage that asset and they also can benefit from that asset in terms of the principal. So if you put a bank account with $100,000, you can't start withdrawing money from that account. So the grantor does retain the right only to the income that's generated from that asset.
Okay, great. So that sounds like it could be a really helpful tool. So what kind of assets, I think you talked about a bank account, what kinds of assets do we transfer to these kinds of trusts?
So the ideal asset is your primary residence. That's often people's sort of biggest asset. And like I said, you retain the right to the income, and that includes the right to live in the house. So it's a great asset to put in the trust so that you can protect it from Medicaid while still being able to live there. And the trustee can also sell that property if it's no longer an appropriate house for you for whatever reason. The trustee can sell that property and purchase a new property that suits your needs better. Additionally, any income producing assets. So if you have a rental property, or if you have even, let's say, a brokerage account, you're not depending on the principal. So, if there's a brokerage account with $500,000, you're not dependent on that, the principal to live. You don't intend to withdraw, large sums of money to do, let's say, any improvements in your house or any other, you don't need it for anything. If you're just relying on the income, well, then it's a great way to protect that asset and still be able to benefit from that income.
Okay, great. So why wouldn't everybody do this? So are there downsides to relying on Medicaid and creating this kind of trust? Tell us, why wouldn't we do this?
So the application process itself is very intrusive and burdensome. If you're applying for a nursing home, you have to provide 5 years worth of statements. So Medicaid really is looking to see everything that you've been doing in the past 5 years, and you might not want them to know these things, and they're going to be asking for explanations. And so it's burdensome, first of all, to even
all of your bank statements, your brokerage statements, and looking at what money was being paid out and what you were spending it on. If you were gifting money, then that could be a problem. Then there are a lot of things that could raise some issues with that application process. And nobody really wants the government kind of going through all of their financial information necessarily.
Exactly. And it's also difficult to sort of obtain all of those statements. So it can be a lot of work, and you have to qualify each year. There's a renewal. So it's not as if you apply and then it's for life. There isn't a renewal process each year. As I mentioned previously, with the trust, you are losing access to the assets that you're putting in the trust. So you have a trustee who's now managing the assets. You're also losing, like I said, access to the principal. So some people have a problem with that. There's also a physical assessment associated with Medicaid. So even if you qualify financially, Medicaid is still going to come in, and I believe there's 2 separate assessments that are done to determine if you do need care and how many hours. So you can go through this whole process and qualify financially, and Medicaid can say, well, you don't really need that care, or you only need 2 hours when really you were hoping to get maybe 10 or 12. There's also a limitation on care. So nursing homes only have a certain amount of beds reserved for people who are receiving Medicaid. So you may not be able to go to the institution that you wanted. Or if you currently have an aide coming to your home to provide services, if they're not associated with a Medicaid approved agency, then you can't continue to get services from that aide. You're going to have to switch to an agency that is approved by Medicaid. And then finally, it may cause some hardships on your spouse. If these assets are transferred to the trust, your spouse loses access to them. If your income is going to this pooled income trust, that can't be used for their benefit. So if there's income that your spouse was relying upon, it might cause some hardships for them that they no longer have access to that.
Okay, and I think this is why when we're talking about assets to transfer, that the primary residence makes a lot of sense, because even though you don't have access to the principal, you can continue to live there. So you're not, if you're not planning on moving, then that can be a good asset to transfer out, and you can continue to live there. But if you were, for example, planning on selling the house or mortgaging the house or something to pay for your retirement, then that's going to that's going to pose a problem. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay, and the same thing with your brokerage account. If you're planning on, and most people aren't just living on the income from their brokerage account, they're also in retirement pulling from the principal. And so if we put that into the trust, then that's just not available anymore. So you may have a lower financial means than you would have otherwise. Okay, so when does Medicaid planning make sense? And so let's talk about first your income. So sometimes we have clients who have a lot of income, and maybe it's going to be steady income, and they're asking about Medicaid. Does that make sense to do Medicaid planning?
Yeah, I mean, if your income is not sufficient to cover the cost of your care, and then you have to sort of dip into the principal, that's a situation where you want to consider Medicaid planning, because you're going to have to, because then you're going to be spending down your resources, and you're potentially not going to have anything left over for your children or for family members. And if that was your goal, then yes, if your income is not sufficient, then you certainly are going to want to consider Medicaid.
Okay. And I think we talked about this. If your home is your primary asset, that makes sense to transfer your home is one of the most common ways that we do Medicaid planning, and you plan to stay in that home. And also we find is that, because Medicaid does require or entail loss of control, or Medicaid planning does entail some loss of control, that there is a trade-off. So you're kind of giving up your control over your assets and for your future heirs, basically. And so is that something that you want to make that trade-off? And some people, it really just depends on their particular situation. And I'll also say that you don't want to do this unless you have, if you're transferring things to your kids, to a trust for your kids, if you're not on good terms with your kids, if they even have any iota of a trust issue that you have with them, then it's not something maybe that you want to do. Okay, so we're going to take a couple of case studies here. So this one is, we have Joan. She's 70 years old. She owns a home that's worth about $500,000. She relies on Social Security and her pension, which is about $100,000 a year. She has a brokerage account of $500,000, and she's very close with her children. How would you advise Joan? She comes to you and says, is there anything I can do? I know I'm concerned that I've had friends that I've seen that when they have to have care, more extensive care, that all of the assets end up being depleted and their kids end up with nothing. Is there anything I can do about that?
This I think would be a good situation where Joan can transfer her home into the trust. It's a great way to protect that asset for her children. Sounds like she has this income that she can rely on, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend that she transfer her brokerage account into the trust, but it sounds like her home would be the ideal sort of asset to ensure that is protected for her children later on, and it's not going to have any sort of impact on her day-to-day. She can continue living in that house, or if she needs another house, again, her trustee can sell that house and purchase another house for her. It's just a great way to protect that home.
Okay, great. So this is sort of, I think, our almost like the key case, or the typical case where Medicaid planning, doing the advanced planning, it makes a lot of sense. Okay, so second case we have, Jose is 85 years old. He's diagnosed with dementia. He owns a home worth $500,000. He relies on Social Security and a pension, and he has a brokerage account of about $500,000, and he's close with his children. So he's in a state here, he's still financially, or he's still mentally capable, but he has been diagnosed with dementia. So it's the sort of near future is a bit uncertain. What are the things that we want to look at here?
So this creates some sort of complication. So the whole point of Medicaid is the importance of Medicaid is planning early. If a client comes to us, whether at the point where they've been diagnosed with dementia, if you transfer the home to the trust or any assets to the trust at that point, there can be an issue because he may need Medicaid within that 5 years, and there's already been this transfer, and that can create a penalty. So I guess that it's really going to be dependent on everybody's specific situation. If he's diagnosed in early stages dementia, and the doctor doesn't expect it to progress severely, and it's going to be very slow onset, then maybe it does make sense to transfer at least the house into a trust. Otherwise, if it's sort of he's diagnosed with dementia and it's sort of at the end stages, well, then transferring the house to the trust is not going to provide any sort of benefit for Medicaid purposes.
Okay. And then maybe what we can do also, we kind of look at the cost of the care, and maybe we can save the home. Like maybe we can transfer the home into the trust. And if we can cover the medical expenses with the brokerage account and his income, then maybe by the time the 5 years is up, if we use, I mean, we're going to use all of those assets, but maybe we could still save the home. Does that seem like that might make sense?
That could make sense. Yeah, exactly. And then obviously, if he is married, he would be able to transfer it to his spouse and qualify. That wouldn't cause any issue. And the spouse can then, the well spouse can transfer it into a trust. But in the situation where there is no spouse to rely on for planning, we can do, yeah, exactly what you said.
Okay, case study number 3, John. John is a healthy 85-year-old. His income is $500,000 a year. He owns 3 apartment buildings in Brooklyn worth $10 million, owns a house in the Hamptons worth $5 million, and a brokerage account of $2 million. His daughter has been in and out of rehab for the past 5 years, and his son is partying it up in Ibiza. John comes to you and says, I heard that there's this great thing called a Medicaid trust and the government will pay for my care. What do we tell John?
Yeah, so John is the classic example of somebody who's not really appropriate for Medicaid planning. He has extensive assets, and for him, it's more probably appropriate for him to pay privately for the type of care that he's going to want. It sounds like he's not going to be concerned about providing for his children. Ultimately, I would imagine that his primary sort of goal is making sure that he has the best care, and he has, like I said, extensive resources to provide for that care. So it doesn't sound like Medicaid planning really would make sense. In this case, there'd have to be a lot of assets transferred to the trust for him to qualify, and presumably he's dependent on those assets for the type of lifestyle that he's living. And so I think it would be a significant change in lifestyle if he were to try and qualify and transfer assets into the trust.
Okay, great. Yeah, and even with his $500,000 a year income, that if we put that into a pooled income trust, he's basically losing money because the cost of his care is going to be less probably than $500,000 a year. So if he's doing Medicaid, so even that alone, you're just giving money away basically at that point for not great care. So yeah, so John, sorry, but there may be some tax planning we can help you with, but Medicaid, probably not a good option for you. Okay, case study number 4, William. William is a healthy 75-year-old. He owns a co-op in Harlem worth $500,000. His income is $60,000 a year, brokerage account of $100,000. He has long-term care insurance with a 5-year limitation period, and he is close with his kids. He would like to preserve his co-op for his kids, and he's worried that maybe his long-term care could exceed 5 years, and he doesn't want the government to end up with his co-op that he worked very hard for.
So this is a bit of a trickier situation because co-ops very rarely allow transfers to irrevocable trusts. So while it would be ideal to transfer the property into a trust, there might be certain limitations with that. There may be ways around it, which is sort of outside the scope of this presentation. But that's a complication that we would have to go through with William.
Okay, so this would be, if it wasn't a co-op, it would definitely make sense. And even though he has long-term care insurance, if it goes beyond, his care needs go beyond the 5 years, then that if he hasn't done the Medicaid planning, then it could eat into his other assets. So that otherwise would make sense, but again, like you said, co-ops in New York City here, we have just a lot of issues with co-ops. So unfortunately, that can be a big problem. I've heard of sometimes it can be done, but it definitely depends on the particular co-op, and you definitely should not assume that will be permitted. But it is something that you can ask your co-op board about, or your management company about, and see if that's appropriate. So just to kind of recap the factors to consider: what is the person's annual income? Do they own their home, and do they plan on staying there? Are they close with their kids? how important is the quality of care to them. If they want the highest quality of care, then Medicaid might not be the best option. How important is their need for independence or control of their assets? And that final issue of if the home is a co-op, can it be transferred? Okay, so I hope that that was helpful. And if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We do have just one question about whether the slides will be shared later on. And there will be a link to the presentation, the recorded presentation, but also if you email us and ask for the slides, we're happy to provide them. And just a disclaimer that I didn't make at the beginning was that this is all for educational and for informational purposes. So for your own particular situation, you definitely need to consult with an expert in this area. This is not a kind of thing you want to go it alone. And if we don't have any other questions, then we will wrap it up. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned for our upcoming webinars. And if you have any particular topics that you think would be helpful, then please email us at info@thevillagelawfirm.com and let us know what your concerns are. And we'd love to get your feedback on what other presentations that we can do would be helpful for you. Okay, have a great day, everybody. See you soon.